Welcome all. We are looking at the lost comms procedures, and to bring this to context, we are looking at instrument rating airplane ACS, and this would be lost communications, area of operation 7, task A. What we want you as a student to know is procedures. Wait, wrong one. Task a little higher. There you go. So what we want the student to know is risks, skills, and overall readiness to handle the loss of communication while operating in IFR. And that starts with recognizing and trying to troubleshoot this. Possible reasons for loss of communication, so that's risk management. Deviation from procedures, that's a risk, because what happens if you don't do it as expected. And the skills, recognize the loss of comms, makes sense, you don't hear them. Well, although we'll talk about this more. Simulate actions, so when you'll be flying, you may be put in a situation where a DP says, okay, well, now suddenly you lost comms, what do you do? Determine where to continue to flight, plan destination, or deviate. That's good, serious, and not always easy decision. Determine appropriate time to begin the approach. Yep, that's in the regs 185, and using SRM or CRM. So that's all that there is in 185. Well, that's all that is in area of operation 7 task A, and most of that is in the 9185. So, lost communications while on instrument flight plan. Instrument flight plan, the flights on instruments relies on communication heavily. We are in contact with ATC, they manage traffic in their area of responsibility, and rather frequently they would deviate you from your whatever you filed. I probably never flown more than a third of the way without getting some form of vectors or other instructions. So communication is critical. Now, once you go through this lesson and internalize the seriousness of the lost comm situation, start looking at how procedures are designed, and quickly you realize that a lot of those procedures are built around what happens if communications is lost. Because if communication is in place, whatever you do, you can just say help and they'll give you vectors. But if you are on your own without comms, then things suddenly become very serious. So a lot of emphasis on the lost comms. This will definitely come up on the check ride. Hopefully won't have to experience that in real life, but better be ready. Okay, now how this starts, if simulated or not. The symptoms are pretty simple. You're not hearing the center. Maybe you call them and they are not responding back, or maybe if you're more proactive, you realize that it's been 10-15 minutes and you have heard nothing, which is pretty unusual. You most often hear other planes and center or approach talking to each other. And turns out most of those lost comms issues are actually user induced. The main one, you just turn down the volume because you are breathing an approach, talking to your colleague, and you turn down the volume and 10 minutes later you forgot. So verify your equipment, starting with volume and squelch. And through experience that I had, I am now very mechanically pushing the squelch button before I even want to start communicating, just to make sure radio works. Squelch means you disable the noise suppression and you hear the white noise back, which means your headset is working, your radio is working. So you do a basic equipment check by just pushing the squelch. Then next, frequency. flying with students, you tell them to put a 123.05 and they put in 123.50. Like, it looks close enough, right? So that happens. Then we get into more serious things. Power. Is the power on? Lights up? I had that situation in one of the Twinox planes. The actual physical switch was malfunctioning and the radio went dark. It's pretty easy to diagnose that when there is no power. Then you start looking for what's going on. If you have a second radio, assuming that power is up, both radios light up, and you key the mic and you see the TX, the transmission, being active, maybe the radio is functioning but not putting out a signal. Obviously, try the second radio. If you have handheld, that would be another possibly good idea. Depends how far you are. And then another frequency. If you've been speaking to center, it is possible their radio would have failed, maybe. Or you went into a dead zone and you may be able to hear other people on other frequencies, just not this one. Almost the last resort, try 121.5. If you are in IMC, and we'll get back to this, and you are not able to communicate, that is a brewing emergency. That's pretty serious. So 121.5 in this case, definitely a fair resource. And let's imagine all this fails. You are not able to hear anything, talk to anyone. You squawk 7600. That is a separate piece of equipment that will broadcast your status. Now, ATC will realize, okay, this guy was not responding for a good reason. He has an issue. Let's make sure other planes are not in his way because you don't know what else is failing. So you notice how much I took just going through those steps. In real life, if a student, you tell him, hey, simulating the situation where you talk to a center and there's nothing, and they immediately squawk 7600, that's not correct, right? There's a lot you can do. And again, in my experience, it happened with Aurora Tower. My volume was down. It was embarrassing. So everyone been there, well, or will be. Okay, but you notice how I was stressing that if you are in instrument conditions, because flying on an IFR plane, if you lost comms and you are in visual conditions, what you have to do per regulations is stay in visual conditions, in visual flight rules, and land as soon as practicable. And that's a specific word that's in the 91-185. Doesn't say as soon as possible. However, at least once in history, when a commercial jetliner lost comms and they decided not to land at the available airport, but proceeded another 50 miles and landed where they were going to, that pilot got a lot of heat. So if the check right question comes up, what do you do? Well, first of all, they will always set the stage like the following. Imagine you are flying on an IFR plane and your radio went out. What do? Do not jump to conclusion that you are in IMC. The first response would be either you clarify, am I in visual conditions or instrument conditions? Or just say, if I'm in VMC, I proceed VMC and land as soon as practicable. And then you may have a discussion what it means. So lost comms in VFR, remain VFR. Obviously, squawking 7600 still is a good idea. You land where practicable, you call nearest tower on a cell phone, let them know, hey, I'm on the ground, safe in one piece, radio is dead, close my flight plan. That is required. But a whole different situation is if you lose comms in the IMC conditions, in instrument flight rules conditions. You, if you are able let's say you're flying through the clouds, you lost comms, you've been troubleshooting, and you happen to get out from the clouds. Again, stay in those conditions, which means if you have to alter that course, you do. That's one very important thing you have to say on the check ride. If I encounter VFR conditions, I alter the course, I stay in VFR, I'm not flying into the clouds again. So that's one big takeaway of today's lesson. Then we go into the acronyms. The acronym for lateral navigation is A7-A. If you lose comms in IMC, so in the clouds, can't see where you're going, you have to be predictable to the IFR system. After you squawk 7600 and did all the checks, now you have to figure out which way are you flying. Avenue F goes in that specific order. So in this case, that's important. First, you look at whatever ATC has last assigned. If you filed Hillsboro to Eugene and ATC told you fly Salem direct and then Eugene, that's your assigned route if you get those instructions on the radio. Alternatively, second option, if you are flying and they say, hey, 76 Foxtrot Alpha, 20 degrees right for traffic. And you probably see traffic on your radar, you've heard the communication, you know that there is a plane going opposite direction. Those kind of deviations would be short term, so you go around the traffic or around the weather, and then you typically rejoin the course. So you follow that vector, and then you'd be expected to get back on your course. So don't go that 20-degree heading forever. The next, expected. Along with deviate 20 degrees right for traffic, they would often say expect return to your course, resume navigation in 5 miles. and this is where if you watch the rules of IFR flying, you'll start notice those built-in safety features. When they tell you, and they will give you instruction and they say expect something, it's because if you lose comms, you go to this expected route or altitude. So if they tell you deviate 20 degrees right for traffic, expect you're back to your own navigation in 3 minutes, that's your instruction in case if you lose the comms in that period of 3 minutes. So when the time expires, when this expect the route comes, you fly what's expected. And last, if you have not been assigned, vectored, or expected or anything, you fly what's filed. If you file direct Hillsboro to Eugene, you fly that route. But again, Avenue F, that goes in the sequence. So in that specific assigned, vectored, expected, and filed. Example, if we are clear to Aurora via Newburgh, dub me, given the frequency and the squawk, and say the ceiling is 500, and you climb out of Twin Oaks and you get pattern altitude, and boom, you didn't even have time to contact ATC. You're barely at pattern altitude and no radio. Would you go back to land? That's pretty risky. There are hills around Twin Oaks. There are definitely more than 500. So at this moment, it's pretty much no going back unless it's an emergency. So if you are unable to contact any ATC after you're doing all the quick checks, definitely squelch, radios, power, you squawk 76, and you fly the route that you were cleared to fly, your craft clearance, basically. That's an example. Vertical navigation. Now, between, what did I use example? Between Aurora and Twin Oaks, there are almost no peaks, a little bit, tiny one. But if you go Twin Oaks to maybe Redmond, there are some decent mountain peaks at 7, 8, probably more, 1,000 feet. So if you look at Victor Airways, there are alternating different minimal en route altitudes. And now this comes into the play. But unlike Avenue F, here you're looking for the highest of the following. And the acronym is MEA, very confusing because that's MEA is not minimal en route altitude. And even the M stands, you'll actually see a lot of people saying that M stands for MEA. It doesn't. If you read 185, it says minimum altitude for IFR operations, which means could be the MOCA. Depends on where you're flying. The MOCA could be significantly lower. And the general rule for this situation, if you can get lower and closer to the ground in better visibility, that's a good idea to do that. So the highest of the minimal allowed altitude for IFR operations or expected. So if you're flying at MEA, but you were told to expect 13,000 in 5 minutes, when the 13-minute is out, you'd climb. Or in this case, it's opposite. Let's say past the waypoint, you were told to expect 11,000 in your craft clearance. That expectation applies to the whole route. So here's the Twin Oaks. You get in your craft, says 76 Foxtrot Alpha, climb, maintain 5,000, expect, actually, example, 10,000. Climb, maintain 10,000, expect 11,000 in 5 minutes. You lose comms, you get on your flight. If you are on airway that has MEA of 12, you have to go to that despite assigned 12, despite being assigned 10 and expect 11. If your MEA is 12, that's where you go. Then you go through waypoints, say maybe Newburgh or some other one, and the situation changes. The MEA drops, but your assigned is still 10 and expect is still 11. At this moment, you may be flying significantly higher than you have to. However, that's the 91, 185. You choose the highest of those altitudes. Minimal en route altitude charted, expected altitude, or assigned altitude. Arrival. Now that's another tough part for the lost comms. And I have to say, not without some contradiction. And specifically what it says is, if, in the unlikely case, by the way, if the clearance limit that you were given is a point from which approach begins, then either at EFC time or at your ETA time, you will start the approach. So imagine you were cleared to a waypoint X. Waypoint X happens to be the initial approach fix. Great. You get there at or after your ETA or EFC, and then you do an approach. If you get there before, all you do is hold. But question, Ryan, you're probably flying some approaches now, right? How often do you get a clearance where the limit is the initial approach fix?
I haven't started the actual proper instrument flying. So far I'm only on the instrument scan and practicing.
Okay. Well, maybe that...
I'm actually one flight away from actually starting the first instrument training section.
Nice. I'm excited for you. But does the question make sense? Have you practiced craft clearances? You know how they happen?
No, I haven't done those yet.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll spoil it for you then. The most typical craft clearance, you're flying to Eugene, they'll clear you to Eugene. You're flying, on my previous example, to Aurora, you'll be cleared to Aurora Airport. And Aurora Airport is not a fix from which approach begins. So it's very, very unlikely in real life that you'll actually be cleared to a waypoint from which approach begins. But still, That's that's the case. Now, I've heard people intentionally putting a IFR flight plan to a waypoint, the initial approach waypoint. So if you see that, if you encounter that somebody is building a instrument flight plan not to an airport but to a waypoint, Chisholm or something, that's just my favorite one, or some other waypoint, and it looks like it's in the middle of nowhere, but it is an initial approach fix. It has some merit to that because if you lose comms, it's a very easy, predictable path. If you don't lose comms, they'll assign you the route anyway. Then it almost doesn't matter what you filed. So pretty smart. And yet, I may be wrong, but majority of IFR flight plans, they go airport to airport. So how do we deal with that? So clearance limit is not a fix from which approach begins, which means it's an airport. Then, similarly, if you're early, you have to hold at your airport, and then you proceed to the initial approach fix of the approach that you choose. Now, note here, the 91-185 does not limit to which approach you would use or which fix you would select as initial approach, which also means suddenly this situation became real hard for both approach controller and the pilot. You're looking at an airport with 5 different approaches, different approach fixes, and your clearance limit is an airport. You have to decide from this airport, first of all, how you hold there, what kind of holding pattern is even safe over a airport. Second is how you get from that airport to a to initial approach fix. And then of course you pick a approach at your discretion, and approach control suddenly doesn't know which way you're going. But the correct answer for how do you begin the approach in case if you lose comms is just that. You have to hold at your clearance limit, and then you have to leave that at either EFC, expect for the clearance, or at your ETA, and proceed to a fix from which approach begins and commence that approach. Okay, so let's take a quick pause and look at the actual regulations. By the way, ecfr.gov, amazing website. Whether you have FAR AIM or not in paper, this is a nicely formatted website. So the first one we spoke, if failure occurs in VFR or VFR conditions are encountered, you shall continue flight under VFR. And like, I struggle a little bit, but the word shall, the way they use it, it means you must continue. You cannot go back into IMC. Then IFR conditions. So the route, that's Avenue F, assigned, vectored, and by the way, each pilot shall continue the flight according to the following. Then in absence of assigned, I guess the word suggested, in absence of assigned route, by the route that ATC has advised may be expected. So there's avenue, the E, and in absence of assigned or expected by route filed. So there's the avenue F. Now altitude is the altitude or flight level assigned, and that's the highest of. The minimal altitude for IFR operation. Then Ryan, like, trust me, at least once you'll see somebody preaching that this is MEA, and now you'll know that's not MEA, that's the minimal altitude, which could be MOCA as well. And then expected. So there is your MEA, minimal altitude, expected altitude, assigned altitude. Now, leave the clearance limit. when the clearance limit is a fix from which approach begins, that's pretty easy. You commence descent as close as possible to EFC, or if it has not been, to a time of arrival, ETA. There you go. So again, pretty easy. If you file to a initial approach fix, amazing. You get there early, hold. If you get there late, you just proceed. Now, if the clearance limit is not a fix on which approach begins, that's where probably the hardest part. You leave the clearance limit at EFC or ETA. So that's the hold number 1 on the picture. And proceed to a fix from which approach begins. Now, here is the question, which one? There are 3, 4, 5 approaches. So which approach? And each approach has multiple fixes. And the answer is whatever you decide, SPAC. And then you descend and commence the descent and approach as close to ETA, estimated time of arrival, whatever you filed or amended. So pretty simple, but if you now look on the map, your typical, see, I did this easy. I did this slide in more of a linear form, but imagine if you'd be filing from Twin Oaks to Eugene, then your approach fix is probably ways out. So you have to hold here, then go back to a fix, then do a turnaround, and then go fly an approach. So suddenly becomes not very logical. Now, we got to the end of 91-185. And this is where I would like to bring this to a another thought. And I think that this would be a possibly useful point to bring up in your oral, especially if you're prompted for this. PAC is the final authority to ensure safety. So you've been flying in the clouds and suddenly your radio failed. Is that just bad radio, or is there something else failing? Is there fire eating your cables, or like voltage is lower than should be? Is there something going on? So if you suspect that this may get worse, you just claim the 91.3 authority. The pilot in command has authority to keep the trip safe, the airplane and crew safe, and do whatever it takes, deviate from any rules. I believe it says up to extent possible to maintain safe flight. You may have to just do whatever it takes to do. Now, another example, like let's say we file to Sacramento. You got from Twin Oaks, and the ceilings were maybe 3,000. You climb 4,000. You were told to expect 5,000. The whole Oregon to California is in the clouds. Would you really fly 10 hours? Well, it says 3 hours, but multi-hour trip in IMC when you know you were just here in Twin Oaks, and if you just do a 180 and safely descend to like below 2,000 feet, then you'll see the ground and go land. Again, not the book-wise correct answer, but at some moment this ADM comes in place. This may be the safest option to squawk emergency, the 7700, 7700, and just go back and land at your airport, despite that's not what 185 wants. So, and by the way, yeah, controllers, they do give a lot of special handling to the lost comms procedures. And if you'd ask a controller, well, don't quote me on this, but I bet if you'd ask a controller, would you rather have this airplane fly those whole 4 hours with no radio, or just squawk 77 and go back? they would say, yeah, just go back, land, and come back later when you have the radio fixed. But, however, you must know what 91.185 says and means, and it comes down to this metrics. If the clearance limit is a initial approach fix, yes, no, and you given an EFC, you leave it at EFC. If not, you leave that at ETA. If the clearance limit is more normal human being situation, the airport, then you leave that airport and go to whatever initial approach fix of your choice and do an approach. If you give an EFC at that time, otherwise just ETA. That's it. And if you'd like, I'll send you a little quiz to play with. We're done. Okay, so that's it for today. 91.185 comes down to those 4 options. You have to know this by the book. Big deal. TPs take a lot of weight. They put a lot of weight. They take this very seriously, because if the radio actually fails, you need not to kill yourself or run into any other traffic, and you know how to handle this. Because if you do, the things will evolve in expected way, in controlled way, and everyone will be safe and happy. If you fly random directions and squawk random codes, at least IFR system will go on hold, and FISDA will probably calling you with a lot of questions on how did this happen. So you can turn the situation from a minor, hey, my radio failed, I flew the route, to the whole Seattle airspace had to be put on pause because you were just being unpredictable. So don't be that guy. That's it. Hope that was useful, and I'll stop the recording and clean it up, post it soon.